This is Brian McVeigh. Welcome to my presentation called Hallucinations as Adaptive Behavior, Divine Voices and Visions as Neuropsychological Vestiges. First, let me point out that this presentation was originally given at the Toward a Science of Consciousness conference, April 9th to the 14th, 2012. What I would like to do in my presentation is tie together 5 propositions or 5 links or 5 parts of an argument that taken together constitute my presentation. The first link concerns mental imagery, something that we are all familiar with. It's something that we see with our mind's eye. The second link concerns affinities or commonalities between introspection and hallucinations. And of course, introspection is just another way to express the idea of mental images. The third link, and this is the most controversial, evidence of an earlier mentality in which hallucinations were actually adaptive. The fourth link, reactivations or a return to vestigial neurostructures that cause audiovisual hallucinations. Present-day anomalous behavior aids in appreciating the hallucinatory nature of subjective inner visualizations as adaptations. And of course, by the word subjective inner visualizations, that's just another way to express the notion of mental images or introspection. Finally, the fifth link. Things come full circle here. Mental images are cultural, not biological, but cultural adaptations that emerged relatively recently in history, probably about 3,000 years ago. Well, let's begin with a question. Why didn't people record their inner experiences in any detailed manner until the latter part of the second millennium BCE? Of course, administrative records, annals, chronicles, religious poetry, epics, wisdom literature certainly exist, but these lack a certain characteristic. These don't seem to have any indication that the people who recorded them were experiencing psychological events or psychological processes. Okay, well, so let's focus on the inner experience. And as I said, I'm using a set of concepts interchangeably: subjective inner visualizations, mental images. In any case, how have researchers described inner experience, or what we witness with our mind's eye? Picture-like representations, quasi-perceptual experiences, mental representations. These terms, I think, are vague, problematic. They don't really explain anything. Well, before going on, I think it's very important for some clarification. We have to distinguish between perception and introspection, or what we see with the mind's eye. Unfortunately, researchers, as well as the layperson, uses these terms interchangeably, but in fact they're very different, and they need to be clearly distinguished. For one thing, inner experience occurs without external stimuli. You can imagine anything in your mind without actually having to witness it using your senses. Introspection is usually, not always, but usually it's under voluntary control. That's not true for perception. What your senses experience, of course, are things that, in a sense, you're forced to experience. So to change the language a little bit, we can distinguish between perceptual reactivity and conscious interiority. In conscious interiority, this is something I'll be talking about in a moment, actually includes a package of different cognitive features. And one feature of conscious interiority that, for my purposes in this presentation, I want to focus on is introception. And introception overlaps with what we might call mental images or introspection, but actually it's a little bit different. We don't have to worry about the nuances at this point. Well, conscious interiority, and by the way, probably most people would describe conscious interiority as consciousness. There are other features that characterize conscious interiority besides introception, such as spatialization, self-autonomy, a sense of I-ness, me-ness. Please note that introception shares some features with hallucinations, and this point really is crucial to my argument. However, before going on, we first have to distinguish between hallucinations and illusions. Illusions occur when an external stimulus is distorted or somehow misinterpreted. Hallucinations, however, occur without any actual perceptual experiences, more than just mere sensory distortions, misinterpretations, or deceptions, which require some external objective sensation. Let's talk a little bit about the nature of hallucinations to understand them better. They appear as if in objective space, in other words, in the real world, not in your mind. And they are externalized or projected as if they come from outside the person. Hallucinations have the same realistic qualities as actual physical objects. So how have hallucinations been explained in the literature? Various reasons have been given. None of these explanations, to my mind, are very convincing. Usually, so-called causes are just descriptions of circumstances when hallucinations most likely occur. They are not explanations in themselves. Well, before going on, I think at this point it's very important to introduce the work of Julian Jaynes, because his research in many ways has informed and inspired my own thinking. And this slide here, I won't spend much time talking about it, but this slide lists some of the key features of what a moment ago I called conscious interiority. And for the purposes of this presentation, it's not important to give a detailed accounting or explanation of these different features, but in any case, I think it's worthwhile just to introduce these key concepts in order to get a sense of what Jaynes was talking about when he wrote and theorized about the nature of consciousness or conscious interiority. One of the important theoretical contributions made by Jaynes is the notion of what he called the bicameral mind. And again, for the purposes of this presentation, it's not necessary to go into a very theoretical, detailed explication, but I will mention that for Jaynes, what the bicameral mind was about is on the right side of the brain. The idea would be that in that part of the brain, gods would speak. In other words, the individual would experience audiovisual hallucinations. And these hallucinations, though they were created on the right hemisphere, would be experienced by the person on the left hemisphere. So the idea, according to Jaynes, is that until about 3000 BCE, people were not conscious in the way that they are today. People lacked conscious interiority. People lacked the ability to use what we would call the mind's eye, to introspect, to look within themselves. They lacked a sense of awareness. Well, I think one way to better appreciate what Jaynes is trying to say is to look at 4 historical periods. And the first period can be labeled early bicameral. And this was when the new neurocultural adaptation was configured by pressures caused by the agricultural revolution, starting about 10,000 BCE. The second period can be called literate urban bicameral, or early classic bicameral period. And during this time, civilizations were characterized by direct God to mortal communications. In other words, people on a regular basis experienced what we would call audiovisual hallucinations. But of course, to people back then, they actually experienced gods and ancestors talking to them. The third period can be called bicameral breakdown. Now, this is an intervening period between the second and fourth period, which witnessed a transition from the bicameral to the post-bicameral neurocultural paradigm. And of course, the post-bicameral neurocultural paradigm just means, or is just describing the period when people started to acquire consciousness or conscious interiority. And as I just described, post-bicameral period. This would begin around the 12th century BCE. Well, let's talk about what I call theophanic experiences as adaptive behavior, or in other words, hallucinations as adaptive behavior. Theophany just means the appearance of a god or the divine disclosure or display. For my purposes, theophany refers to a manifestation of any supernatural being. Could have been Yahweh, a god, angel, ancestor, ghost, familiar spirit, angel. There were different types of theophanic experiences. Direct. This is when a person experienced a god or an ancestor in a very proximate, immediate manner. In other words, a materialization of a being in one's presence. Indirect. Intermediate and distant. For example, speaking through a prophet's mouth, dreams, visions. In other words, some sort of deity or an angel would visit an individual in his or her dreams. Divination. Indirectness is often enhanced by symbolism that was in need of interpretation. Another type of theophanic experience, visitations. Okay, the supernatural being chooses to visit a mortal. And then invocations, attempts to elicit a visitation from some divine entity. Well, we can take these four types, or actually they're, I think, better characterized as four perspectives of theophanic experiences, and we can put them together. And so we will have direct visitations, and some examples of that might include being visited by ancestral ghosts, personal and mediating gods, demons, messengers of Yahweh. We can also talk about direct invocations. For example, calling up the dead. We can also talk about indirect visitations. Old Testament prophets, visions, dreams, vision dreams. Finally, we can talk about indirect invocations. Now, indirect invocations actually usually do not involve hallucinations, some sort of divination or dream incubation, which is practiced in the ancient world. Okay, well, now let's turn to the next part of my presentation, reactivations of vestigial neurostructures that cause audiovisual hallucinations. And there are different examples. In fact, there are many examples that I could give, but for my purposes in this presentation, I want to focus on what are called otoscopic phenomena, or mirror hallucinations, in which an individual sees his or her second body, or a double, sometimes called a parasoma, in extrapersonal space. Well, how do we account for these autoscopic hallucinations? Are they a vestigial form of an earlier neuropsychology, as I just discussed previously? Well, for our purposes, there are three major types of autoscopic phenomena. Autoscopy proper, in which one sees one's double. This is also referred to in fiction as doppelganger, and also in folklore. There are many stories of doppelgangers. The second is haeautoscopy, and this is a bit difficult to explain. The second autoscopic phenomena. This is when you see a double. However, it's not clear to the person having this experience where their, you might say, real self is. All right, and so it's different from it's different from autoscopy proper, because you know where you are and you see your double. But in haeautoscopy, you're not sure where you are. And then finally, something that we hear a lot about, out-of-body experiences. Well, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the next slide. There are many explanations to account for autoscopic phenomena, and none of them, I think, are very satisfactory. I think there's something deeper going on. It's not just a matter of misperception. After all, there's a world of difference between associated with and caused by. And we should be interested, I think, in what causes these audiovisual hallucinations. And we should note that describing the neurology is not the same as explaining why an hallucinatory autoscopy takes a particular morphology. Well, if autoscopic phenomena are remnants of adaptive neuropsychology, as I contend they are, then perhaps seeing with the mind's eye is an updated hallucinatory experience geared toward the modern world. Well, since around 3000, from about 2000 BCE, or excuse me, 1000 BCE. And here, if you look at this slide, I should note that I'm focusing on only three types of autoscopic phenomena, and researchers give different names to them. But there's a fourth one that I haven't really talked about, but I think I'll mention it anyways. Feeling of a presence. In other words, you have a very distinct feeling that there's some personal entity watching you or behind you, very close to you. Well, now let's talk a little more about introception. And I think it's important to point out how introception is employed in the selection, rehearsal, planning, and perfecting of adaptive activities. That's actually a quote from someone else. Introception is a means to guide experimentally and transform experience by running off activity cycles as mental simulations of the real thing. So that last sentence explains the adaptive aspect of introception, or using your mind's eye to plan things without actually having to do things. So the primary function of consciousness, or you might say conscious interiority, or you might say a very important feature of consciousness, introception, mental rehearsal of adaptive goal-directed action through the experimental manipulation of perceptual motor imagery. Introception conjures up viewable cognitive map of the world, infused with a menu of maybes, perhaps, possibilities. So to conclude, if perception is sensory reflection of the physical world, hallucinations superimpose experiences over perception. So I would suggest to avoid any negative associations with the word hallucination we use a different idiom, a different language. For example, superception in place of hallucination. And that describes a cognitive technique of going beyond what the immediate environment affords the individual. So the point I'm trying to make is that introception, or what we experience with what we see with our mind's eye, if you will, is a type of hallucination. However, it's a very useful, a very adaptive type of hallucination, or what I would call superception. Actually, we can break superception down into 4 types, to be a little more exact. The first would be extraception, or audiovisual hallucinations of gods and ancestors that people experienced thousands of years ago. The second type of superception, vestigial extraception, anomalous behavior, for example, otoscopic phenomena, schizophrenic hallucinations, and of course I just spent some time giving some examples of otoscopic phenomena. The third type of superception, introception, or an interiorized model of reality. And again, I know that I myself have used a number of words interchangeably, but just to clarify, when I say introception, for all intents and purposes, I'm talking about introspection, or what we see with the mind's eye, or what some people might call subjective experience. And then a fourth type of superception, paraception. This shares attributes of both perceptions and superceptions. It's sort of a leftover category that includes what some researchers call pseudo-hallucinations. Usually when we interiorize cognition, in other words, when we are conscious, we experience coception, which is an alignment of perception with introception. In other words, at any given moment, or we experience both perception, or information coming from the physical environment, with what the mind's eye is witnessing, introception. Now, there are good adaptive reasons why perception and introception often overlap. Right? The latter is generated, though not determined by the former, but they do not necessarily have to align. Well, I'm going to wrap things up, and before I do, I just want to list a few works that I think are very important, that deal with many of the issues that I have discussed. Probably the most important reference, of course, would be the book by Julian Jaynes that came out in 1976, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Also, 2 more references for those of you who might be interested in pursuing these topics. Reflections on the Dawn of Consciousness, Julian Jaynes' Bicameral Mind Theory Revisited, edited by Marcel Kaushton. And Marcel also put together another book that I think is very useful for those of you who are interested in these topics, the Julian Jaynes Collection. And if someone would like a much more detailed, written out version of my presentation, please feel free to contact me. This presentation has been based on a paper called Hallucinations as Adaptive Behavior, Divine Voices and Visions as Neuropsychological Vestiges. Well, I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention, and please do feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments about my presentation. Thank you very much.